Hey, this is David with Streaming Relativity, home of the Astro DNA Observatory, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about back focus in astrophotography, what it is, how to achieve it, and it's actually a relatively simple concept that all too often I see it misunderstood or people confused by it on various forums. So hopefully this tutorial will clarify some things for folks out there and result in better um, images in your astrophotography work. So to talk about back focus, I think it's best to first start with focus in optical systems in general. And so if if we take a telescope, every telescope has something that is called its focal length, and simply put, that's the distance from the objective lens or the primary mirror that's at the front, typically at the front of your telescope, not always, to the point at which all the incoming light that lens is gathering, converges, and it converges into this theoretical point. It's where all the light meets at one point, and that's called the focal point. And the focal length is just a measure of the distance from that focal point and your objective lens. And that the focal length is not always published. You rarely see it published by manufacturers. They prefer to cite two other data points. One is the obviously the aperture or the diameter of that objective lens or primary mirror. That is, the larger that diameter, the more light gathering capability your telescope has. And then finally, based on the design of that lens or that mirror, there's some focal ratio or f number. And so we typically see something like an f7, f10, f4.5, whatever. That is your focal ratio. And from those two data points, the focal length can be calculated simply by multiplying the aperture by the f number. So if we were to take an example, if we had an 80 millimeter um, aperture telescope, and we had it had a focal ratio of f7, then its focal length would be 560 millimeters. And telescopes generally, so telescopes generally also include a focuser, which is a draw tube um, that sits in the back and allows us to move our eyepiece or camera sensor, whatever we might have connected to the back of the telescope, closer and further from this focal point. And we do that to achieve fine focus. And so it's best to illustrate this. So we have this objective lens, let's say it's an 80 millimeter lens, and from the back of that lens, um, we have an image path that converges down based on the lens design to some focal point. That focal point for this particular telescope, assuming it's an f7 telescope, it's about 560 millimeters away. That's our focal point. Notice that this is inside the optical tube assembly. And from that focal point, we see that the image proceeds and widens and lands at some focal plane back here. And let's just say it's a camera, it could be an eyepiece, it doesn't matter. And as I mentioned, most telescopes do come with a focuser, and that allows for adjustment in or out, racking in or out of um, your eyepiece or your camera, so that it is either closer to or further away from the focal point, and that allows the image to be um, focused on this focal plane, based on its distance and other things. So this is a very simple illustration of focus in a telescope. Now, in astrophotography, um, we may wish to employ corrective optics past the focuser and but before our sensor. And we do this to improve image quality. The image that's coming through and landing on this camera is not perfect, and so corrective optics can help us improve that. And a couple examples: one might be something as simple as a reducer, which is a lens assembly that in essence reduces the focal ratio of your telescope and the apparent focal length of the telescope. And we do this to speed up uh, to speed up our telescopes. Our classic Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes usually have like a focal ratio of f10, which is really kind of slow, requiring long exposures, and that opens up the door for all sorts of other issues related to our rigs. So if we could reduce that to, let's say, an f6.3, essentially we're able to get more light more quickly onto our image sensor. There's a sacrifice there in terms of focal length, but this is not an atypical scenario. So reducer is an example of some corrective optics, and another might be a field flattener or a coma corrector. And this is a lens assembly which, as I mentioned, the image is curved, so it's not landing squarely on your sensor. So a field flattener and will reduce that curvature, bend those lights, those light rays, so that they land more squarely on the image sensor. Coma correction is another discussion, and it has to do with off-axis light and how it is projected onto sensors, and you can get stars that start to look a little bit like comets. So typically, coma correction and field flatteners, they combine these corrective um, features. So these corrective optics, you generally attach them to the focuser, right? So behind the focuser, not in front of the focuser, behind. Attach it to the focuser, and once you do that, they introduce the corrective optics themselves introduce their own required back focus. In other words, in order for this corrective optic to do its job, whether it's to reduce or to field flatten or coma correct, it has a requirement that from the back of the optic to your image sensor, you must meet a specific back focus distance in order for it to function as it's designed. And that back focus is typically published with your corrective optics. So, and again, the required back focus is measured from the rear of the corrective optics to the image sensor plane. And you achieve this back focus, you're going to have a bunch of things between your corrective optics and your image sensor typically. So you sum the optical width of the image train components, including any spacers and adapters that you're using in that train, and the sum of the optical width of those components must equal your required back focus. And if we look at, let's go back to our diagram, again, we see nothing has changed relative to the objective lens, its focal point, and its projection back through the focus adjuster. The only thing that we have changed now is we've attached some corrective optics. It doesn't matter, reducer, field flattener, coma corrector. We've introduced optics. From the rear of that optical cell to the sensor, camera sensor or eyepiece, you have to achieve this required back focus. And all of the things that you might use to do that might be spacers, it might be filter wheels, it might be off-axis guiders, a rotator. There are things, any of the things that you're using in your optical train, they must add up to your required back focus distance. Notice that you can continue, your focuser continues to behave as it normally would for your camera. That is simply focusing the image plane onto your corrective optics. But this is post-corrective optics. This is a fixed required back focus that you must achieve. Okay, so so let's take a couple examples. One of my telescopes, the William Optics Zenith Star 61. I use a flat 61A. This is a field flattener with it, and very simply, there's a required back focus published with the flat 61A, which is 67.9 millimeters. Now, my optical train, I have a number of things in it, and I'll illustrate this. But this train back here is made up of many components. Number one, my camera itself, my ZWO 1600, the monochrome pro camera. Without the spacer connected to it, it has a native back focus of 6.5 millimeters. I directly attach my camera to my electronic filter wheel that has a width of 20 millimeters. I then use two spacers, one 21 millimeter, another 16.5 millimeter, and that gets me to 64 millimeters, which is short of the required back focus that is published for this corrective optics. But this particular flattener has an adjustable section. So this is just a set of threads that allow me to push the the optics assembly out or draw it in. And drawn completely in, I would have to make up the distance with another spacer, or in this case, I can draw it out by a total of 3.9 millimeters, and that achieves my total required back focus of 67.9. Okay, so this is a quick picture of this. And so camera 6.5, filter wheel 20, spacer 21, spacer 2 16.5, corrective optics with 3.9 millimeters of adjustment through the threads, and that provides me with my required back focus of 67.9. Now, just to illustrate, this is the other side of that. Notice that this draw tube here, which is controlled by my electronic focuser, here is a fine focus knob, coarse knob on the other side of it. That is independent, completely independent of the back focus that I have achieved from the back of the corrective optics to the center. Okay, so I can still focus. This allows us to focus our telescope on a specific target without disturbing the back focus that we've achieved for the flattener. Okay, so another example, I have a Celestron C8, a classic SCT, and I use a 6.3 focal reducer with it. And so this is a great resource, by the way. I'm not. It's a wilmslowastro.com. There's a little formula that you can plug into, and it'll help you calculate the proper back focus distance for your setup. It's also fairly well published. The Celestron C8 with the Celestron 6.3 focal reducer has a back focus requirement of 105. And in this case, I also use an ASI 1600 6.5. I have a filter wheel 20. I have a nose piece adapter, which I'll show in a moment, that takes up about 1 millimeter. And then I have an off-axis guider, which is 16.5. I've introduced a spacer, which is 11 millimeters, and then I have their T adapter, which is 50, which I achieve my 105 back focus. And just a quick look at this. Here's the reducer. The adapter, the adapter screws onto the back onto this reducer, and that's a 50 millimeter distance. I have a spacer here, which is 11 millimeters, which connects the off-axis guider. And then in between my off-axis guider and my electronic filter wheel, I actually have, this is a nose piece adapter, uh, this allows for kind of rotation of your camera to get proper, get the framing that you want. A few screws on the off-axis guide that loosen that and then tighten it. I'm not a fan of this, by the way, but that's a side discussion. So about 1 millimeter for that spacer. Perhaps it's 2, but it seems to be working out okay for me. Um, and then the filter wheel, of course, at 20, and then a direct connection between the camera and um, and the filter wheel. And that's how I achieve my 105 millimeters of back focus for the C8 with the reducer. Um, I want to also just drop. This is a great image. It's floating around the internet. It's actually really useful, regardless of the optics that you put into your the corrective optics that you're using. If you have not achieved your back focus and you are short of where you need to be, you're going to get this radial effect on at the edges of your image. It's going to look as if you were kind of rushing into your image, and so it's like suddenly hopping into light speed, poof, But at any rate, if your image is looking like this, you need to increase the back focus distance with some additional spacers, and then if you are too far away, then your back focus is too long. You're going to see these kind of curvature around the edges of your field, and this you can address by simply decreasing the back focus. And this is an excellent guide. And take your time with this. There's no use the recommendations of your corrective optics as your starting point, um, and fine tune it as you need to. And take your time doing this. Don't rush this. Just get it right. And when you get it right, it actually really pays off. This is I took this image just a few days ago. We had one evening of of beautiful skies here, and this is the Soul Nebula. I see 1848, minus its head. I always think of this as almost like a fetus. But at any rate, this was a result of bad framing on my part. I was asleep while it was happening. I was running this autonomously through a sequence that I had set up, and I should have pre-plate solved just to see how it was going to frame and adjusted it. But anyway, nonetheless, this is a really cool emission nebula, star formation region, maybe around 6,000 light years away in our own galaxy. And overall, it's about 100 light years in width, maybe 150. And I took this with the William Optics Zenith Star 61, so obviously it has an aperture of 61 millimeters. And it has a pretty fast focal ratio. It's a f5.9, and that leads to a 360 millimeter focal length, like we discussed. And I do use the flat 61A, which I think does an excellent job of correcting curvature and coma correction. There's almost none here anyway. But so the back focus was 67.9, as we discussed. The camera I'm using is the ASI 1600 Pro, and negative 10 degrees Celsius, a gain of 75, offset of 12. I think that works out fairly well for me in this target. And this is a stack of 20 by 2-minute exposures. I could have done, I've done much longer exposures, but I just wanted to try this setting out and see what it looked like with a short stack. And so my pre-processing and my stacking is done in serial. I think I'm going to cover that next time. And my post-processing on this image, this is 100% just 3 or 4 level adjustments and a very, very gentle curve. I just love to look at the details in these regions. So anyway, I think it's a beautiful image. Notice that edges of the field are looking pinpoint, sharp, beautiful. Just follow the instructions. for back focus, and I think you're going to get some great results. All right, listen, if this was helpful, I'm glad. If it enables you to get nicer photographs, fantastic. If you like this type of content, just like or subscribe to the channel. Next time, I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-processing and stacking. I use a manual workflow for my narrowband imaging, and I use Serial for it. And I want to go through the reasons why I do it manually as opposed to using some of the scripts that come with or that are available for Serial, which I think are great. But why do I do it manually for my narrowband? I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So I'll do that next time. Thanks so much, guys. I hope you enjoy the video.